start. Okay, so today it's my pleasure to have like Professor David REHKOPF from Stanford University on social, and he specializes in social epidemiologist. So I always have some time to pronounce epidemiologist. So now I got it right. Okay, so he work mostly on how social economic policy change is going to influence basically our life, particularly now. He focused on how influence the range of early markers of disease and aging. So we particularly focus on recent focus on the DNAs. So he has published widely in some leading journals like Nature Sustainability, American Journal of Public Health, Health Affairs, Epidemiology, so on and so on, all those leading journals. Okay, so today he's going to talk about something tells us. Okay, so now I think it's David. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction. Thanks for inviting me here. To come see you in person sometime. I was mentioning earlier the last time I was in Singapore was in 1997. So I'm due for a return visit sometime soon, and hope to meet you all in person when it's safe to travel again. But it is nice to be able to be here remotely and be able to have dinner with my family tonight and still be able to present to all of you. So thanks so much. Feel free to interrupt. I have about 35 minutes sort of slides to present. Just speak up at any time. The way I have it set up here, I'll kind of be looking at my slides. So if you raise a hand, I might not see you, but just unmute and go ahead and interrupt, and I'd be happy to answer your questions at any time. So I'll go ahead and share my slides here. Okay, does that look all right?
Yes.
Great, thanks. So there's two main things I want you to get out of my talk today. So two kind of take-home purposes. One is some understanding of the influences of tax credit policy, anti-poverty policy on childhood obesity in the United States. And then the second is about some methods that I've been using and exploring using to understand what's known as heterogeneous treatment effects, or heterogeneity of treatment effects. And all that means, if you're not familiar with that term, is that the overall estimate of an effect that we estimate in epidemiologic studies is what 99% of studies focus on, this overall sort of treatment effect. But what's also interesting is trying to see if there's particular parts of the population, particular subgroups, who benefit more or less from those effects. So in epidemiology, we call that effect modification, but it can be also thought of as heterogeneous treatment effects. And what I'm going to talk about here are some machine learning approaches to searching over parameter space to try to find those. So what's typically done is, people will test a few variables, test if the effects differ, but I'm really interested in exploring like a much more detailed frame of covariates to try to identify the really specific groups that benefit or don't from a particular policy in my case. And so I think that has a lot of policy relevance to really know if who our policies are reaching in terms of producing health outcomes, and whether some people are being left behind and potentially even being harmed by some of those policies. And in that case, we'd want to come up with complementary policies. So in terms of the overall scope of my talk today, I'll first talk just kind of descriptively about the relationship of income to health in the United States, why I'm in particular interested in it. Then I'll talk about my work on the earned income tax credit, which is a very specific tax policy that reduces poverty in the United States, and look at the effects of that on childhood obesity. And then in the third part of the talk, get into some of these heterogeneity of treatment effect algorithms. And again, feel free to interrupt at any time. So here's the basic description of the relationship. This is from my dissertation paper quite a long time ago in BMC Public Health. And it shows the nonlinear relationship between income and the hazard ratio for mortality in the United States. So hazard ratio is on the vertical axis, the horizontal axis is income. And what you see, this is the kind of the bars behind it are the distribution of income in the United States. So what you see is this at the lower end of the lower half of the income distribution in the US, you see higher rates of mortality up to around 3 times the average for women and around double the average mortality rate for men. So that's a pretty strong association, a threefold or twofold risk in mortality. But what's interesting about that is it's not just people in poverty in the United States, it's actually up to around median income that you see this association with mortality. But what's also interesting, then it's flat after that. So, earning more money after a certain point doesn't buy you more health in terms of mortality, but it is a pretty wide section of the US population, about half the population, where there's some effect between level of household income. And I shouldn't say effect, some association here between household income and mortality. So in this paper, I controlled for a number of kind of common confounders, but didn't really have kind of a causal identification strategy as I do in some of my later work I present. So why might this be the case? We did sort of a systematic look. This is an American Journal of Epidemiology a few years back with some of my Stanford colleagues, looking at what kind of hazards, what kind of environmental hazards, biochemical hazards, physical hazards, infectious diseases are associated with household income in the United States. So we looked at 31 infectious agents, 90 biochemical factors, 209 environmental factors. And we did a real an in-sample, out-of-sample validation of this. So we did something that's like a GWAS study, if you're familiar with that, looking at a lot of associations. We adjusted for multiple comparisons, and then we tested that in a different sample. And we found that 66 of these factors were independently associated with income. So that's a huge amount of correlation in terms of really statistically significant and meaningful associations with all of these different factors with income in the United States. And here's kind of a list of the ones that were hazardous factors, protective factors that were positively correlated with income. So a lot of dietary factors, a lot of environmental factors that were hazardous as well. Here were things that were negatively correlated with income. Blood cadmium's much higher. Lead is higher at lower income levels. Cotinine, benzene. And so the reason I'm showing this is just to talk about the potential importance of policies that deal directly with income in the United States. So I don't think it's really an either or solution. I think if we want to improve health, it's important to focus on all of these factors in the environment. But because there's so many hazards that are associated with income, to me, that's an argument for saying, let's actually try to address income itself and potentially prevent a lot of these, address a lot of these risk factors that are associated with chronic disease. So what are some barriers in the context of the United States to taking a social epidemiologic approach to policy and really dealing with social determinants of health and intervening on them? Well, one of the criticisms and this Preda and Voigt editorial from our article in the American Journal of Bioethics went through a lot of these arguments, and I pulled out some quotes from them on the other side, and we responded to this in another editorial, criticizing their point of view, which I'll talk about now. But one of the things they said is that in the United States, it's unrealistic to expect such pervasive changes in the current political climate, and this was back in 2015. So just saying, well, actually, there's really nothing we can do about that. Poverty just exists. In the United States, there's too much political divisiveness. Nothing's going to really occur. And I really disagree with that, because I see examples of that every day. Every time I open up the newspaper, I see policies that change. And one of those is the earned income tax credit. I'll say, despite the fact that the United States is really pretty far behind, both Singapore and the UK, France, a lot of other countries that I think about in terms of using evidence for policymaking. There is a really renewed effort that came about, and that was actually a bipartisan effort between Republicans and Democrats to pass some of this legislation. So this was back in 2017. where folks in Congress got together to say we need to use more evidence in the U.S. to evaluate our policy and try to figure out what works and what doesn't work. And this isn't the kind of thing that makes the headlines. Not many people know about it, but I have seen in the U.S. government, expansion of the sort of entities and expansion of funding for projects that really are trying to get more, use more data to inform the choices that are being made in the U.S. Even as we're far behind other countries and really trying to catch up in that way. So what I'm going to talk about today, given that background, is the earned income tax credit. And that's because it's a really actionable policy. It's something that can be expanded at the federal level, is expanded or decreased as different people come into office. And actually different states, in all 50 US states, some states have an additional credit, others don't. And that can be expanded or decreased over time. So we really want to build evidence for what the effects of that are. So the earned income tax credit resulted in a transfer around $56 billion to US families per year and lifted 3 million children out of poverty. It's what's considered a neoliberal policy in that it's tied to work, and it's usually dispersed as a tax refund.
Yeah, hey, David. Yes.
Yeah.
Just for clarification, right, for here in Singapore. So for that tax credit only works for those people who actually work, right? So if you do not earn any income, you don't get any benefit, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so you can see that here. So if you look along the bottom axis here, earned income, exactly your point there. If you're at 0 earned income, you get 0 earned income tax credit. As you work and earn more and more income up to a certain point, up to around, once you're earning $10,000 to $20,000 a year, you get a tax, not just a tax credit, but you actually get paid back $6,000. So imagine that, you're in a low income household. So not the lowest income, the very poor earning no money won't benefit from this. But if you're earning $12,000, $15,000 a year, which is still below the poverty line in the United States, especially for a family of 3, you'll get $6,000 back. So it's pretty generous. Imagine that you're earning $12,000 a year and you get an additional $6,000 a year from the government. So it's a pretty substantial change in income level for those households. And then what happens is it's called the phase out region. So then the more you earn, then you start getting less and less of the EITC up to around $50,000 a year, where then you don't get any credit anymore. So it's a targeted policy, but it's targeted in the sense that it's not just for the very poor. It's kind of like lower income and near poor and people below the poverty line. And this was really a result, again, of the sort of US political system and wanting to encourage work, but then essentially supplement the earnings that people are getting, if that makes sense. The other thing to note here is that it's almost exclusively for households with children. So at the very bottom is this no children line. It looks kind of the same as the 3 or more children line, but those lines at the very bottom are for no children, 1 child in purple, and then those top 2 lines are 2 or 3 children. So it's really a benefit. You get almost nothing if you don't have kids in the household. 1 child, a lot of money, and then 2 or 3 or more children, the most benefits. Does that make sense?
Thanks. Yeah.
Okay. So one of the things we can look at it, and this is how much, just a plot of how the benefits of the program have changed over time. And the solid lines here are the maximum amount of credit that you could get, and the dashed line, the solid lines are for 2 children, and then the dashed lines are for 1 children. And so, showing from 1990, this is over the period of time of the study that I'll show you, there were a lot of increases in the EITC, and it happened kind of in a nonlinear way. And it happened differently for households with 1 or 2 or more children. And so we use that in order to look at the effects of the policy. But over time, there have been in the 90s, this was during welfare reform under President Clinton, there were expansions of this policy. The other thing that we can use to try to get at effects is some of the differences in states. So this wasn't all implemented at the same time, but over the last 20 years, really over the last 30 years now, states have implemented the EATC at different periods of time. So we have a lot of states, non-refundable EATCs just mean if you don't owe any taxes, you don't get the money back. So usually those aren't too generous. But the states shown in blue are states that have an EATC. And if you know anything about the sort of electorate or the geography of the United States, a lot of the more politically conservative states are in the middle of the United States and the South. And what you'll notice here is that this isn't completely correlated with that. So a lot of states which are considered, more conservative, like Nebraska and Kansas, Louisiana, also have an EATC. So it just helps that there's more kind of matching between these states in terms of comparison states for our analysis. So I've done a number of studies, just showing 3 here on looking at the effects of the EATC on health. And I've generally used a few different types of modeling strategies here, but based on the state differences that occur and looking at what the effects of a state implementing the EATC are, and then also the federal increases that happen. And we use a modeling strategy that's based on something from, generally from a lot of different economists, but, specifically related to looking at the effects of tax policy from John Gruber at MIT and Emmanuel Saez, who's, here, I guess he was at Harvard. This was a while ago, but he's at Berkeley, has been at Berkeley for a while. And this is a fantastic paper. And what they do is, they control for factors that determine any of the benefits, and then the exposure itself is actually the change in the tax structure. So what we're essentially doing is looking at people in different places in different periods of time, and the sort of thought experiment here is like, you could be the same individual, but if you live in a different place or you're there at a different period of time, you'd receive a different amount of EATC. In their case, they're looking at other tax changes. We're thinking about EATC. So there's no, so your actual characteristics themselves won't determine how much EATC you earn. Therefore, it's like less confounded and more easily to get at sort of some inference questions about what the effects of the EATC are. So in thinking about our overall study and then the heterogeneity of treatment effects study, the primary study question here is, what are the effects of changes in the earned income tax credit on childhood BMI from ages 2 to 18? A substantial public health problem still in the United States. And then the second is the heterogeneity of treatment effect question. Do effects of the EITC vary depending on the characteristics of the individual, their household, or their state of residence? So here we're going to look at, as I kind of talked about at the introduction here, we're wondering, we get this overall estimate of EATC on childhood BMI, but does this effect vary depending on the characteristics of that individual or where they live? So again, estimating, so what are the kind of approaches to estimating treatment effect, heterogeneity of treatment effects? The first, which a lot of people do, which is completely standard, is to either do stratified analysis or look at an interaction term or effect modification. But the primary drawback in that kind of standardized approach is that it's really limited in terms of the number of different effects you can look at. So all of a sudden you get into really small sample sizes in the subgroups if you want to look at more than 1 or 2 characteristics. And then you also get into just an overwhelming number of potential subgroups if you're thinking about anything more than 5 or 6 factors and how they interact with each other. And so this is really good if you have, and this is the way I use it, if I have strong priors from the literature. For example, I think effects might be different by gender. I pre-specify those, look at those, effects in the population. But then where I'm interested in some of these more machine learning approaches, the real advantage is using those to do something more descriptive and exploratory over a more complex and larger number of characteristics. So the primary contribution of this question is thinking about who benefits most from the policy, in this case, the EITC, but you could do it with any policy, really any treatment. All these things I'm going to talk about work the same way, whether you're looking at sort of pharmaceutical treatment, a behavioral intervention, a public policy, all can be used in the same way. So one is about who benefits, who is harmed. I think that's important to know about. The other is thinking about the generalizability of the results, or what's in epidemiology is sometimes called transportability. So, we have this overall effect. We kind of assume this works for everybody, but by looking at heterogeneity of treatment effects, we can have more of an idea of who the results might generalize to. So what I'm going to show today is results from 3 different approaches to looking at heterogeneity of treatment effects. The first, as I mentioned, a priori stratified analysis, very standard, where I'm kind of using this as kind of the baseline of what is typically done in the literature. But of course, you can get interesting results from that. The second is something from Torsten Hawthorne's party package in R, which is a decision tree based approach. I'll describe this more in detail, but what this is, it's based on decision trees or recursive partitioning. So what you'll do is, and I'll mention this again, so I'll mention it twice just to because it's a bit nuanced and complicated, but you have a fixed sort of regression model with a dependent variable and a predictor variables as you'd normally look, and you have you specify a fixed part of the model. And then you specify a whole bunch of other covariates or factors, a vector of those, however many you want, and the algorithm will search over over those covariates and over split points in those covariates for what variable, what a particular variable with a particular split point for which your beta coefficients on your predictor variables that you fixed in the model will be most different. So I'll talk through this again, but what it does is essentially search over a whole bunch of subgroups of the population in an iterative computational way to find beta the fact where by what factor do the beta values differ most in your regression equation. So a third approach that we'll use is from Amai's Find It package in R, and that's a more feature selection approach. So what the approach they take is just fitting a massive number of interaction terms in the data. And in my case, it'll be over 50,000, fitting those on subgroups of the data, and then using lasso regression, look and try to get a parsimonious model and essentially drop interactions terms that don't help with predicting your outcome of interest. And so really like data-driven, iterative approach, kind of brute force approach to finding those interactions that are significant. The reason that works better than the a priori stratified analysis is that it's done in a more robust way by fitting this on different subsets of the data to try to get something that's stable and then the ability to make statistical inference from those results. So the data I'm going to be using for this project is from the Children of the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth. It's a longitudinal study of kids who were 14 to 22 in 1979. So I'm taking the women who grew up who were 14 to 22 in 1979. I have a lot of information about them that I can use, and I'm using their children and looking at the obesity outcomes of the children of the NLSY 79. And this is all publicly available data for anyone who wants to run these analyses or similar analyses or replicate my findings. So we have in our analytic data set, 20,000 observations, around 2,500 individuals. The exposure is EITC calculated from tax tables, which is based on the data from total household earnings, number of dependents, years of earnings, and the state of filing. The focus in the model is the difference in EITC benefits between the current year and 2 years prior, based on 2 years prior earnings and household characteristics. So I want to talk a little bit very briefly about my motivation for that. So I don't want people's change in earnings, which could potentially confound the results, to be included. So I use sort of fixed earnings, and then essentially look at, based on that fixed amount of earnings, would you get more or less EITC or the same amount of EITC 2 years from now? And then I look at the difference, so the gain, as my exposure of interest, which is sort of both has advantages for causal inference, I believe, and then can discuss that more in the question and answer period, but then also has advantages for being the most policy relevant because it's actually based on achievable policy actions. I can see a question in the chat. What are the characteristics of these effect modifiers? They have to be part of treatment exposure. Great question. So I have, this is one of these things where, often people are like, oh, anything that's machine learning or AI is atheoretical. And I think, we can bring a lot of theory and a lot of, knowledge of study design to the way we fit these algorithms. So what I do is I intentionally picked only effect modifiers that could exist prior to the exposure of interest and wouldn't be on the causal pathway or possibly on the causal pathway or after my exposure of interest. The one thing I will say about that is I can't argue that any of these effect modifiers that are prior to the exposure are exogenous. So they may be confounded. So you have to take the same sort of caution in interpreting any of those factors that I identify as you would anything in kind of like a standard observational study. So I can do quite a bit to make sure my exposure of interest I don't think is confounded based on my identification strategy, but I can't say the same for these effect modifiers that I'm going to look at in these models. The outcome is body mass index percentile using our Center for Disease Control age and gender standards. And I'll just be using pretty standard linear mixed models to take into account household clustering. I think I already had that talked about that slide. Yeah. Okay. So here's my overall model. Not looking at the heterogeneity of effect yet. And I get a beta coefficient of negative 0.006, which is statistically significant, whether I use the linear mixed effects or the panel linear model. And this is how $1 of EITC affects one BMI change in percentile. So $1,000 of EITC decreases on average BMI percentile by 0.6 of a percentile unit. And so you can imagine the maximum level of CD of around $6,000, you're decreasing child BMI on average by about 3 percentile points, which for something like obesity, for something that's like a tax policy, pretty like upstream, I consider like a pretty good effect size. Like if it was larger than that, I almost wouldn't believe it. And so, we see these small effect size, but something that I think is clinically meaningful. And we try to control for a lot of different things. In addition to having that identification strategy, we control for a lot of other kind of individual characteristics in these models. So we feel pretty good about these estimates. So now let's get to what do we want to look at the heterogeneity from. So first of all, we look at a lot of contextual variables. So we know the state where people live. We look at 17 different factors on characteristics of those states. The other thing we want to look at, we have really rich data. So there's actually thousands of different variables in this data set, but what we did is we looked through for 53 different factors. It's based on kind of a research group consensus of things we think like might modify the effects that would be plausible effect modifiers here. So this is just to show you a correlation matrix of all these factors. So at the state level, there's a lot of things that are moderately correlated up to 0.5 at the state level, but all these things are kind of, interesting on their own. There's not a lot that we could drop out from this. At the individual level, not much correlation between all 53 of these factors. You can see a little cluster of correlation there. That's just with the race ethnicity data. So if someone's white, then they're much more likely to be, if they're white, they're much more likely to not be Black or Asian, et cetera. So you have some, just because of the nature of these indicator variables, they are somewhat correlated there, and like Hispanic being more associated with white. But overall, that there's another bit of a cluster between where people were born and foreign born and region of birth in the United States. But other than that, not a lot of correlation there. So this is kind of, to me, I always run these things just to say, okay, it's worth it to have all these characteristics because they're really capturing different things in the population. And then here's just everything together. So I'll go through these three approaches now, and I have about the last kind of 10 minutes here, getting to now setting up and looking at the results from some of these analyses. So my priors were that a level of unemployment and level of poverty at the state might matter. If there's a lot of unemployment and people can't get jobs, they can't benefit from the ITC. And then gender and age, that seems to matter for a lot of things related to income and obesity. We see different age effects of exposures, different effects by gender. So these were my priors. So this is just, remember the overall, so the metric here is like $10,000 of EITC. So that would be 6 percentile points, or you can think of, $1,000 and 0.6 of a BMI percentile drop. So I looked at the high state unemployment, low state unemployment, medium state unemployment, confidence intervals. Not really anything there. Really no difference. Very overlapping confidence intervals. I looked at state poverty, same thing. Not really an effect modifier. Boys and girls, also not much of an effect modifier. Similar effect among boys and girls. Where I did see, based on these priors, differences in the EITC policy depending on age. So for more adolescent kids, age 10 to 18, it had much less of an effect and decreased BMI percentiles much more among kids that were 2 to 9 years old. I should say, I'm not, in the interest of time, I'm not going to show some other results where we looked at overweight and obesity rather than BMI. You can imagine, well, if you're at a healthy weight, you really wouldn't want to lose weight. We really want to kind of focus on how effective is this, from a public health perspective at decreasing BMI among kids who are overweight. So we also did those analyses, and pretty consistent that, we're seeing effects of this on kids who are overweight, and similar sort of heterogeneity there by age. Okay, so now I'm going to get into the second approach, which is the conditional recursive partitioning based on decision trees. Here's a few of the citations. This is being recorded, so don't have to write this down too quickly if the font's too small. But if you look into recursive partitioning in R, and model-based recursive partitioning is the key here. And that's why, I want to be able to specify a model. And that's the real advantage of this over a lot of other heterogeneity of treatment algorithms, that, you have to kind of put everything in the model and you can't sort of control for confounders. So this is more of kind of a bridge between machine learning, AI approaches, and kind of more standard statistical approaches, which is one of the reasons why I like it. So again, I talked about the steps. The model is fit on all observations, and then the algorithm searches over all these potential effect modifiers for what variable, and then step 3, at what split point those coefficients differ most in those two groups. And then once it does that once, it creates a split, and then it repeats that on those subgroups. So it'll be much easier when I'll show the visuals of this in two slides from now. But then you get these subgroups of the population and what the coefficients look like in these subgroups of the population. So here's just sort of what it's the party package in R, what specifying the model looks like. So at the bottom, I specialize a fixed part of the model, and then I specify the parameters over which to search. So all the other data in the model. So here's what you get out of it. And I've summarized it in the text on the side because it's a lot to fit on a slide. The font gets very small, but I'll kind of read through. So the first split point by which the coefficients in my model, including the EITC exposure, most differ is a variable called pre-pregnancy BMI. And we did that in order to have, again, as this great question came up, to not have BMI of the mom, and this is for the mom, not have BMI of the mom that would like come after the kid was measured. And so we just thought it was cleanest to say, like, before you were pregnant, we're going to take that measure of BMI. And so the first split point was that essentially a measure of obesity of the mom. And so when we get to the results, we'll see that they really differ. And then on this left-hand side, as I'm looking at it, it splits again on pre-pregnancy BMI. The next split variable on the right side is age in months. So that's pretty interesting. This algorithm picked up one of those a priori effect modifiers I'd had of child age. Another split point is the year, and then mom's level of education, and then a level of education of the head of household. So I wrote here on the right, and the way these things work is, I set my alpha P of 0.05, just traditional split. I didn't want the minimum node size. I didn't want any node at the bottom to be smaller than 100. I wanted it to be a meaningful level of the population. And then max depth. I didn't want to continue these splits more than 4. It just gets too complicated and is less robust in my experience. So these are these differences. So now remember, the overall effect we're saying was a -6. Now across these nodes, the actual effect varied from -10, so even more reduction in BMI, to 20, a gain of 20 rather than a loss of 6. So we see a lot of heterogeneity in that overall -6. So the greatest benefit for reducing was earlier birth years, which means like earlier on in the EITC, so not based on age, but also younger ages. So the younger age was really a driving factor in sort of the groups that benefited most. So the least benefit was among women who had low pre-pregnancy BMI. So actually that's something that is kind of a positive. If there's less obesity in the household, and this reduced obesity less, that might be a good thing. The other thing was high level of mom's education. So it may be that things are actually going pretty well in those households, they have more resources. When they got the EITC, it didn't really change much. So these are pretty promising results from this in terms of some of those heterogeneities of treatment effect for EITC. So now we also can look separately at state characteristics, and then that was individual characteristics. So for the state, the greatest benefit was in node 7, that was -34. So all benefited. So there weren't any particular clusters of states that were like positive that actually like increased obesity, but there were actually like decreases across most of the states. So lower levels of Democrats in the state house and lower levels of other kind of poverty benefits. So this was very another positive message to me. So it was states that had less beneficial of other social policies. It was more helpful, possibly because there weren't all these other social programs that were already helping kids. And then when this came in, it actually had more benefits. So now I'll go ahead and talk about the, I took out that slide on both of these combined. So yeah, now I'll move on to the final and third approach, and then I'll just wrap things up and make some time for questions. So this is the Amai lasso variable sectional approach. And I think, what this does is it essentially fits however the level of interactions that you specify with a particular exposure. And so what I wrote out here is 70 choose 2. So if you had 70 variables and you're looking at all of the potential 2 variable combinations with your exposure of interest, that would be 2,415 different interaction terms. If you had 70 variables, choose 3, and you had 3 interaction terms, that would be 54,740 interaction terms. So there's no way you could ever fit that or look at that, and even just look through all those regression results from 54,000 different models. But this sort of method lets you kind of look through all those different interaction terms and then takes the highest and most affected. Here's the this is from Annals of Applied Statistics, the original paper. There's been a lot of applications of that since then. I won't go into this, but essentially the key thing is it uses the lasso algorithm to look at sort of the most parsimonious model that still does a good job of predicting the outcome. So in this case, it uses that to search through all these sort of interaction terms in the data. And so one of the nice sort of outputs of this is just looking at the overall distribution of effects among the individuals. And so that blue line is at that minus 0.6. So that's sort of the average treatment. That's the average treatment effect. And the red is the how heterogeneous treatment is in the population. So you see it like across a lot of the distribution, you're either getting positive 10 or minus 10. And then you have these tails of the distribution that are potentially, up to 20 or 30. So this is a nice way of just kind of visualizing how much heterogeneity there is, in that overall treatment effect for different individuals. So here are just have one slide here to kind of summarize the results of this. So you get out your treatment, which was the EITC, and then the 2- and 3-way interactions that are most associated with a stronger effect or a weaker effect. And so in this case, the number of jobs and whether someone was foreign born showed like the most benefit. So when people had multiple jobs and were foreign born, it had the most beneficial effects on reducing obesity. Also, among children that were born in the South and living in states where there was a higher poverty rate, there was more reduction. A second one was states that had a higher minimum wage, but were in the South, there was more reduction. Another interesting one that BRST fed was an abbreviation for whether the child was breastfed, which didn't interact with any other terms there, education, but on its own, showed that the treatment was more effective if children had been breastfed. And then also pre-pregnancy BMI came up again. So what about the flip side where there was the least effect? So this is where the pre-pregnancy BMI, if they had a higher pre-pregnancy BMI, this interestingly showed, also those same influences of pre-pregnancy BMI on heterogeneity of treatment effect. So something to really consider overall for the policy. So second to last slide here, and I think this is really important. So I want to have a warning about how to use this information. So the sample size, and we talked about this a while back in this commentary I had with Maria Glymour and Teresa Osipuk and AJE. And that is I suggest to use this information on heterogeneity of treatment effect, to use it descriptively and to inform future hypothesis-driven investigations. So especially in a sample size as small as 2,500, I still am kind of see this as exploratory. And what I see as ideal is use this to identify potential interactions and potential subgroups where the effects are much higher or lower. And then in a separate data set and a separate analysis, then use those as your a priori effect modifiers, and then test that very specifically and see if it holds up in another data set. So while even though that's done internally with these algorithms, they're each being fitted on subsets of the data. In my experience, I find that these still can give spurious results sometimes. And so, before sort of acting on that in a policy way, you'd want to repeat this on another data set as like a really hypothesis-driven studies. So in terms of the sort of tentative findings that I put out for other people to look at based on this, heterogeneity of treatment effects is greatest by child age and pre-pregnancy BMI. There's some evidence of better impacts of children of the mom growing up with household hardship or poor health as a child. And there's more benefits for states with generally worse socioeconomic conditions. Thus, overall, I think there's generally a positive conclusions for thinking about the overall effectiveness of the EITC policy for reducing child obesity. And I went over a few minutes on time, my apologies, but thanks so much, and looking forward to your questions. Okay, stop share.
Your visit is in a chat.
Great. Okay. And let's see. There we are. 24,740 terms seems like a lot. I agree. So I got this is why. So it is a lot, and we've done some other kind of data simulation to really look at power and false positives in these algorithms. And I think I think we do find that there are definitely false positives that come up. And so I'd say two things, and I agree that, this could be seen as phishing. And that's exactly why I kind of made that final point. So I'll just say that again. I think I think what you should do, I think it's okay to phish as long as to explore data, as long as you're really, really clear that, and that's what I like about these algorithms. It makes it really clear what you're doing. It allows other people to repeat it. And then you take the information from that, and before you act on it, you test it in a more hypothesis-driven approach, ideally in another data set. And so that's how I think that sort of back and forth should operate. Like, so the way I would present this, and I'm writing up these results now, is I'm not even going to have this HTE work as kind of like primary in the manuscript, but it's really interesting to me. I'm going to put it in sort of supplemental material. I'm going to talk about the results very briefly, but I want to put that information out there for then people to kind of like see the work that I've done. And then other people can follow up on some of those findings and see if they're robust, see if they can be replicated in another data set. All right, so another question, if we are looking for TE within HTE, I think within each subgroup, when imbalance of each subgroup are concerned, can the mob perform matching or also ways packages to check or perform balance? It's a great question. At this point, so some of the other, so there's more recent algorithms and actually just, some papers out even just within the last month by Susan Athey and colleagues at Stanford, who are moving more in that direction that kind of combine some of this search with a matching approach. So I think it's not really out there yet, and not many people have used what she's just put out. But I'd in particular search Susan Athey's recent work, and I think there's some interesting developments that we'll see in that area in the next 3 to 5 years. At the end of the day, though, I think there still are a lot of things that can't quite be automated. I mean, the data is not going to be able to tell you, what's temporally prior. I mean, unless you kind of code that into the data, what might be on the pathway, what might be colliders. So I think there's always that sort of subject-specific knowledge, the study design knowledge, the inference kind of about what the DAG is, what the causal diagram looks like, that the scientist still needs to build into any of those kind of analyses. But I think there's still a real place for this where it can be helpful.
Yeah, I have one question related just for the technical side. Right? For the machine learning one, right? Do you need to normalize all the variables so make the parameter comparable, or you don't?
That is a great question, because most algorithms, that is a huge mistake people make when they're first going into this. So I always normalize all my variables, look at them. It's a tricky, and I don't know if this is the best solution. So I z-score them, standardize them, and then the issue is what to do when you have continuous variables and some categorical variables. And I think, there's evidence to say, just because there's more information in the continuous variables, they'll be more likely to be picked up in this. So I think you have to be really careful if you're using, you can, what I do if I really want to force them in the model is I put the categorical variables in, or the I dichotomize them and use them as a -1 and a +1, just to make them equivalent to those variables that have a standard deviation of 1. But I still think that the algorithms will generally pick up the continuous variables more easily, and so I try to kind of focus on most of those variables and then take it into account when I am interpreting. It's a great question. I should have brought that up in the talk because it's an important point.
It also relates to presenting the results, right? See, when you have many interaction terms, right? Especially when you have a small sample, right? Many of the characteristics could be even highly correlated as well, right? So is that possible to compare like your machine learning, right, with your first approach, you artificially stratified, right? So basically you can combine all those interaction terms together to see whether really the prediction result significantly different from basically just eyeball the sample and see what the difference is.
Yeah, that's exactly what we've done in some of the work. And so, you take those interactions and then you're like, okay, now let's take a traditional approach. Let's create that subgroup. Let's look at what it looks like, look at the confidence intervals, and then that's much more interpretable as well. So, believe it or not, the MI and the Thorsten Hawthorne approaches that I showed are among the more interpretable. Many of the others, it's really, it's hard to get sort of any confidence intervals out of the algorithms. And so you really do have to kind of do this separate step and kind of take them out. But part of the reason I prefer these two is it's actually a little more similar to kind of more mainstream statistical approaches. And so it's a little more interpretable.
Any other question rather than I'm the only person always ask? Okay, so and I also have, see for the second approach, right? They have, so in that one for the node, do you need to like manually pick a few nodes first and then let computer choose, or just computer automatically choose?
Yeah, it'll automatically choose the nodes. So it goes through and chooses the first variable, which at a particular split point in that variable where the coefficients will be most different, and then goes on. So one of the issues with that is that, if there's another variable that's almost as good, that's not quite as good, it will still just pick the first one. And so that's why like random forests were developed, because of that potential issue. And so that's still a potential issue with this. And so, I find by doing it kind of manually on subsets of the data, so I've done kind of like manual tenfold validation to look and make sure the results look very similar in different subsets of my data. And so, you get pretty small when you have a sample size that's this small, but I'm still kind of only interested in those things that I can find in different subsets of the data, or, different splits of the data.
Thanks. Yeah. No other questions? Yeah, also related to your sample, right, for the estimation ones. So either you focus on only on working mothers or everybody, whether they work or not?
Yeah, so is everybody. So everybody was included here. And so yeah, the others are, kind of in the comparison group, but yeah.
Let's suppose the one mother did not work in 1 year, but later they joined the labor force. So in that case, literally just the amount of EITC amount in this like working year.
Yeah. So that's a great point. So in these models, because I have multiple observations per mom, they can contribute information from different periods of time. And the way I structured the data, it'll be their characteristics at different period of time. And then I counted with the standard errors for the fact that, there's that, it's clustered within individual. So they can kind of contribute to the estimates at, when they were working or not working, if they changed over time. But I've also done, fully sort of fixed effect, individual fixed effect models with this too, and results come out pretty similar.
The father of the information also included. The father. I mean, see, for the credit based on the household income.
Yeah. We don't have too much information about the father. So that's, we have head of household education, which will be, however they filled out the survey, but most of the time that's the father, if the father's in the household. So we had that father education. Oh, we even had it as like a father education variable in there as well. So we have that, but we don't have as detailed of information on the fathers. Yeah, so it's a limitation. There might be other things. It looks like another question in the chat here. Might there be a multi-level situation? Tax credits most helpful for low-income households in high inequality states. Yeah, absolutely. So I didn't, I didn't show that just because that figure gets very big. There's a lot more branching. But I did one of the models that included both contextual characteristics and individual characteristics. And then you can see the clusters that are, formed by both. And so there'll be clusters based on state characteristics and individual characteristics within those type of states. So can do that. So it's a good question. So also across counties. Yeah, so it was really just a limitation of the data that I just had the geocoded data on state. So I didn't have kind of smaller area characteristics. But, from what we know in the obesity literature, I mean, perhaps this is motivating a question in terms of both local labor markets, food access, food prices. There's a lot of potential kind of smaller area level characteristics that might modify this that I think would be worthwhile to look at.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Yes, my last question. Okay, sorry, I got a lot of questions. Okay, so for the tax rebate, right? Is that one-time thing? Just rebate all the money at one time, or just go smoothly, not directly related to your estimation?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I do some work on that as well. So it comes at one time. So people usually get that in February or March. So they can apply for their tax refund on January 1st. And then it takes a little while to process it, and they'll get that back in February or March. So they get this at one time. So I've also done other work looking at, what happens, in that month when people get that large amount of money. How does it affect their behavior? So it's interesting because you can request to have it added to your paycheck throughout the year, but like 1% of people request that. Like everybody wants it as that lump sum rather than throughout the year. But I think there's interesting health implications for that. On the one hand, that lump sum gives you, it's kind of like a forced savings. It allows you to buy larger goods, maybe repair your car, buy a new automobile that's important for people in a lot of areas of the US. Maybe pay off some debt, things like that when you have more money. But on the other hand, then you're have material deprivation throughout the rest of the year. And it's kind of this, more fluctuation, which might be hazardous as well. So I think it's a great question and interesting to think about the implications for health.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. Right? So in case, see, for some family, if they have control problem, normally they also poor, so not necessarily politically right, they have control problem, but right, in that case, if you have a lump sum, they just immediately spend, right? Not necessarily have a lot of benefit, right? But even smoothly, just like forced saving, basically.
Yeah, exactly. So, that it's a great question, because that's so, can be so actionable by policy. We could just, change the way it's dispersed. And, I think it would be great to see some states experiment that, and then we could have a nice paradigm for looking at, before and after the change, if it made a difference for health.
Right. All right. So now it's according to 1 o'clock. I better shut up. Right. Okay. Thanks, David. So any last call? Any questions? So if not, so let's thank David for really very interesting paper and presentations. Okay. Thanks, David. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Appreciate the great questions and sticking in there. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah.